I think first order of the day is for people to find their celebration emojis or their applause emojis, because today it became public that Jan Grue is one of this year's recipients of the Free Speech Foundation's prize. And that's for, as the announcement has it, together with Olaug Nilsen and Bjørn Hatterud, he has now received this prize for deres sterke og kritiske bidrag til å belyse samfunnssituasjonen og ytringskulturen for funksjonshemmede i Norge. So that's a big deal, and a big congratulations to Jan. Yeah, here they are, the emojis. That's good. That's all right and proper. Let me introduce Jan to you a little bit more formally. Let me, just before that, give you just a brief outline. I'll talk to Jan. He'll get to address the issues that have been advertised today and his writing on the body. Then Cristina Archetti will respond and elaborate also a little bit on why and how it is that her writings have similar concerns with those of Jan's. And after that, there's a round of questions and comments before we have, I guess, a pretty hard out at 3 at the latest. So that's the setup for today. And yes, one more practical thing. There are so many people present here today that a kind of a hands-up system for indicating that you want to ask a question, it won't really work. So what you'll have to do is just write an X in the chat when you want to say something, and I'll keep track of the chat when we get that far. But first, Jan Grue, who is a professor of qualitative methods at this university. He at the Department of Special Needs Education. So he is a researcher and he's also a writer. He published his first fiction in, I think it was 2011. Does that sound about right, Jan?
2010, so
right.
a decade and a bit.
Right. So that was fiction, particularly short stories. Jan has also published fiction for children, a children's book of poetry as well. So he has several tracks, I guess, in his career as a researcher and as a fiction writer. And now he's in a certain sense in between books, because he published his book that was nominated for the Nordic Council Literary Award, which was called Jeg lever et liv som ligner deres, a life that's like yours. I live a life like yours is the English title that exists in an English translation. And now he is very soon coming out with his follow-up book, which, as I understand it, has some close affinities with the previous one. So could you do us perhaps the favor of, if it's possible, to sort of try and introduce those at the same time, what the previous one was about, and what the new one's about, and what the similarities are.
Yeah, I'll certainly do my best. And just a big thanks to you, Espen, for the invitation to speak here today. I mean, I think it's a great forum to be in. I really sort of love the overall topic of the experiential humanities, and it's particularly at the stage where I am right now with the new book. It's a great time to do some reflective work on the writing process. The new book was sent off to copy editing yesterday, actually. So there's still time to save any major mistakes, as it were. So it's a good time to think about it. But I can take a couple of steps backwards and talk about the previous book first. As you said, it's called I Live a Life Like Yours, and it's about to be published in English. It came out in Norway during the fall of 2018, and it was a really hard and interesting book for me to write. As you mentioned, I've been writing fiction since about 2010, and I became a PhD student in 2007, so I had a few more years of experience writing academic texts. But this particular book, which was subtitled En levnetsbeskrivelse in Norwegian, and which in English is a non-fiction book, a memoir, probably a literary memoir, belonged in neither of those fields. It's neither fiction, nor is it academic literature as such. It's something else, and it was a genre that I hadn't tried writing in before. So there was a lot of experimentation and a lot of attempts, failures, and further attempts in order to get that book right, more or less. So a tiny bit of background is that I was born with a congenital condition, a neuromuscular condition. So I was always, so to speak, a disabled child, a disabled person. And I use the air quotes because I didn't necessarily perceive myself as such. And a disabled identity is something that I grew into very ambiguously and with a lot of negotiation and hesitation. Now, a key moment came when I had become a father, and I had a talk with my father about various things, but they mentioned their archive of papers that they had preserved of various exchanges they'd had with welfare bureaucracies, health services, and so on, while I was a child. And they asked whether I wanted to keep any of these documents. And I said, sure. And my mother came by my office with about a 3-foot wide selection of papers. This was by no means everything, but it was the really important stuff that they'd preserved. And so I sat down to read these papers, which were formal letters, doctor's notes, medical language, bureaucratic language, and which altogether told a very different story about my childhood than the one I remembered. Because of course these letters were, and these documents, these archival records were incredibly depressing to read. They were all about how poor health I was in, the kind of services I'd need, and not least the sort of the really low expectations for my future. So I started writing about these records and about my childhood as a way to, I think, try to reconcile those very different narratives, those very different ways of thinking about and writing about my life. Because of course I did eventually recognize a lot of what was in those documents, sort of half-remembered things, various episodes. So they weren't inaccurate. I mean, in fact, they were incredibly accurate, being clinical, being precise, being bureaucratic. And at the same time, they spoke in a very limited degree to my experience as I remembered it. And in writing about this, I couldn't really do it justice in a completely traditional academic format. So I read one book in particular, which is an American book. It's called The Argonauts. It's written by an American poet and essayist named Maggie Nelson, who describes this as a book of auto-theory. Now, in it, she quotes various theorists of the postmodern, post-structuralist tradition, but at the same time, she writes very intimately about her body and about her embodied experience. And I drew a lot of inspiration from this book and stole a lot of the formal techniques that Maggie Nelson used, including the way that she deployed quotes from theorists with just an acknowledgement in the margin of their name, where the source was from. But the quote itself was fully integrated with what was, to my mind, an incredibly poetic text. And so I tried to do some of that. I tried to use some of those techniques because it spoke much more directly to my experience of trying to explore topics to do with sort of academic disability studies while being personally disabled and trying to find some way of integrating theory with experience. I think that's part of that project and what that book was about. So that was that's the previous book, really.
Yeah.
And that was that became by far the thing I'd written that reached the widest audience. I'd never expected that to be the case, but it happened. The book went into, I think, something like 7 or 8 printings, and it brought me into a lot of different conversations that I had never expected to have with people who wrote to me or called me in some cases to tell their stories, which were in some cases very, very different from mine, in some cases very similar. But I had a half-hour-long conversation with a woman in her 80s who'd grown up in the far north of Norway in a very different era from that of my childhood, and yet she recognized herself in a lot of the things I was writing about. So there was a lot to process after that book came out, and a lot of well, public advocacy, a way of playing a public role in the way that sometimes happens when you enter onto the relatively small national stage of Norway. There aren't that many public figures who are explicitly or recognizably disabled. I mean, we have a prime minister with a disability. We have the leader of the opposition is technically disabled. I mean, disabled people are absolutely everywhere, but they aren't necessarily recognized as public figures who are disabled. So that's probably a topic we can revisit at some point. But to segue into the next book, one of the really weird and interesting things that happened was that I was called up at the end of the year when the book came up, and my sister called me. She's an actress, and she said that she'd been called by a casting agent, but the casting agent didn't want to talk to her. The casting agent wanted my telephone number in case I was interested in auditioning for a TV series. So that was kind of unexpected, but I said yes, because, you know, how often does that happen? And I went in to audition for a small part in a TV series called Occupied, which some of you probably know is a sort of a mainstream near future thriller about what would happen if Norway was occupied by Russia, that kind of thing. So it's seriously schlocky and you know, broad entertainment. But I got the chance to participate in a sort of a real live television production, which had been kind of a dream of mine since I went to film school when I was 20 years old. So I had a couple of days of being on set, trying to read lines without sounding like an idiot, that kind of thing. And that experience was also incredibly interesting because, of course, I played a disabled character. I could not play a disabled character. And I can maybe sort of bracket some of that for now and just note that there were some really interesting things that happened in the writing of the script and in the way that my character was initially portrayed in the scripts and the way that eventually turned out. But I started writing during this experience, which was during the winter of 2019. And I gradually realized that I had quite a lot to say about how my first book was received and how I was more or less recruited into playing a particular part as a public person with a disability, and how that part had certain role expectations and was framed in particular ways in political narratives, media narratives in Norway. So the second book is definitely a continuation of the first, but hopefully it adds a layer to the things that I was trying to discuss in the initial book. And as I said, it's being finalized right now.
Right. I want to bracket for a while the issue of participating in visual media and return to that. But as for the theme of writing about the body, you had explored that in your 2018 book in a number of ways, and we'll go into that. But has your strategy or your way of writing about yourself changed in this book? Is it different, and if so, how?
I'm not sure if it is different. I mean, you since you brought up my sort of the history as a short story writer, Espen, I think it would be fair to say that a lot of my writing is indebted to that, whichever genre I'm writing in. So I mean, I started writing fiction seriously in 2006, I think it was, and I started out by writing a sort of a traditional novel, which was a very bad novel. It still had some qualities of language, and so I had some talks, and I was in development more or less with I think 3 different Norwegian publishers who all eventually rejected that manuscript, and it's a good thing they did. But I also began taking writing classes at one of those publishers. Now, I did that for a year with an incredible writing teacher, Merete Morken Andersen. She's, I think, probably the best writing teacher working in Norway today. And she taught me various techniques for going beyond the thing that you think you're going to write, and to try to look for the thing that you actually need to write. And in my case, that turned out to be short stories. And that's sort of that way of working, of pursuing initial ideas, scenes, topics, initial images, that stayed with me.
Yeah.
So I wrote, it's been 5 short story collections now, and they've all been written in more or less the same way, of just trying to work out what is the core of something that is worth pursuing. And that probably holds true of the 2018 book and this new book as well. There's a cost to doing it that way, because those things, those fragments that I write out don't necessarily have anything to do with each other initially, and a lot of them turn out to be unusable. So the 2018 book went through something like 9 or 10 serious drafts with a lot of stuff being left on the floor, as it were. And that was true again with this book. I started out writing about the television series and about those experiences. And I think I wrote something like 20 or 30,000 words about that in particular, of which maybe a 1/6 is left in the final manuscript. Just trying to pursue something that initially seemed interesting, realizing that it's maybe only interesting to me. It's experience. It's a way of turning my experience into something that I can then proceed to reflect on. But it's not necessarily interesting to the reader. It has to be distilled and the selection has to be made. And then eventually, once I have enough of that kind of material, I have to work on juxtaposition and looking at how the different pieces interact with each other, and if they do so at all. And it's an incredibly cumbersome process, but I don't really know any other way of doing it if I'm trying to write in a literary vein. It's different with academic texts, but for this kind of literature, I really need to try to understand what is there and then build on that.
Right. I've read one of your collection of short stories, and that was it was kind of conceptual. It didn't necessarily have a very sort of subjective and or overtly personal tone to it. So I'm curious what happened. Well, first, am I right that that My Life is Like Yours, it was a kind of a turn to the I for you, writing in that kind of an overtly subjective mode, saying here am I, here's my work, right? So how was that for you to change into the I?
Well, I mean, first of all, you're absolutely right. I mean, I still think of my short stories as pretty personal, but written definitely in an impersonal way. And that is probably some of what allowed me to do the I Live a Life Like Yours as well. That I I think I'm going to refer you to Maggie Nelson again on this. That there was something about the way that she wrote about highly abstract theory in a deeply personal way. Which really unlocked something for me, because I could then make the point that even though I am using the I, even though I'm using the first person, it's only partly about me. It's about particular experiences that happen to be mine, but I'm always keeping some of the larger issues or some of the outside issues in mind as I write about them. I mean, other people can probably do it in very different ways, but for me, it was necessary to just keep that manifest reminder that something else is at stake here. The I that I'm deploying is a literary I. It's also a way for me to try to manage the line between the personal and the private, as a phrase that is in Norwegian, to try to remember that you can be as personal as you like, as long as you remember that you're actually there's a reader at the other end of the text, even if it's only an implied reader or an imagined reader as you're doing the writing.
Right. I think if I remember correctly, some place in your book, you say that I don't like to account for myself. In the middle of a book, that's an account of yourself.
Yeah.
And I kind of got the almost the feeling throughout that there are kind of two forces here. I want to tell of myself, and I don't want to tell of myself.
Yeah.
So could you elaborate a little bit on the forces that were at work there?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that question, the short answer to that question is quite simply it's one word, which is disability. Yeah. I mean, a lot of my late adolescence and early adulthood had to do with coming to terms with the extent to which I was forced to give an account of myself to government bureaucracies. I mean, I've had a lot of dealings over the years with various aspects of the Norwegian welfare state, and even though it is a very generous welfare state in a global context, probably the most generous one that exists, it still demands that all of its users, as the term goes, provide a full account of themselves in order to receive services and benefits. And so I've written countless letters detailing my disability, my needs, turning myself into an object that the welfare state can recognize and acknowledge. And that's a deeply uncomfortable process, because in order to receive the help, the assistance that I need and that I have a right to, I still need to make myself as small and as helpless as possible. That's not a very pleasant thing to do. And so this book remains a counter book. I mean, it's a different way of accounting for myself. It's a way of accounting for myself through literary language, but it's still a process that I found very difficult to undertake, And so I wanted to write that resistance into the book and to try and explain it a little by including a number of direct quotes from the documents in question, and show, I mean, it's a cliche to talk about dehumanizing language, but it's still true in this case, because the person, the child being depicted in those documents is, well, not exactly a human being. It's something on the borderline between a human being and something else entirely, and so that resistance remains with me.
Right. So the agenda of the book that has to do with a kind of a righteous anger against marginalization and the various kinds of humiliations that come with it. Is it right to say that those records are your sort of means of coming to write about that, your sort of way into writing about it?
I think it's probably it's useful for me, at least, to think about it in terms of technique and in terms of different linguistic registers. So I came across a couple of things when I was a postdoctoral fellow in sociology. I worked on chronic illness, particularly on myalgic encephalopathy, which is a chronic contested condition, would be one way to phrase it, with people who have very adversarial relationships with the health services generally, and people who either have been diagnosed with ME or who might have been diagnosed with ME tend to write a lot about their experiences, and they provide a lot of material. And one of the things that stuck with me was a blog where the author had written about her medical records, really trying to encapsulate a medical document within the framework of a blog and using her language to deal with that language. That's a really interesting technique. And there are by now quite a lot of authors in Norway and elsewhere who do exactly the same thing when writing traditional novels. Britt Bildøen is one, but there are many others who use the sort of the fundamentally polyphonic character of the novel to make clinical language, bureaucratic language, and so on, one voice among many. And that works. It really does, because the dominance and the power that is within clinical and bureaucratic language is real, but at the same time, it can be in juxtaposition, in reframing, be made to look silly, be made to look ridiculous, and that's a very useful technique in, you know, reframing the issues at hand. The impact of receiving a letter, I'm sure many of you know this intimately, the impact of seeing yourself described in this kind of language can be intensely personal, and it can be as I already said, very uncomfortable. But to try and reframe it within a different linguistic mode provides you with you know, a way to exercise counterpower.
Right. A general question, again, starting from a quotation from your book that really grabbed me, is a sentence that addresses head-on the question between thought and the body. And the sentence is: min største utfordring at fremmedordene strømmer for fritt, for manisk, at ordene mister ankerfeste I kroppen. That is, my greatest challenge in writing is I lose my anchoring in the body. So what is so crucial about anchoring in the body, and how do you sort of try and go about that?
Yeah, I mean, in that passage, I'm probably talking a little bit about a writing challenge, because I mean, I well, I recently turned 40, and so that was another chance to look through some old archives, like old school essays. And I was a little bit disconcerted to see the degree to which I'd assimilated a very adult way of writing from a really early age. It was a little bit freakish, actually. But of course, I was, you know, a disabled child who needed to know these things from pretty early on. And there's a facility in this kind of language, which is also impersonal and pretty hostile to the life world. So in writing I Live a Life Like Yours, I wanted to really dig past that. And one way of doing it was to simply reach for the poetic, which the auto-theoretical mode of Maggie Nelson was one way of doing, but really also to force myself to write slowly, to use silences and gaps. That's why the book is formatted with block paragraphs with open lines between them. It's not really a normally running text. There's a lot of white space in that book, and that was necessary for me to be able to write it. But I also think that it helps the reader process it, because I do use a lot of complex words in that book, and so sometimes you need to simply take a breath, and then ideally there's a scene nearby or a physical reminder nearby of what that academic word actually means in practice. Right. It's also a way, I think, of trying to reconnect what I think is an absolutely central concern of many theoretical modes, that there's the central concern in that theory with embodiment. I mean, one of the most important theoreticians to me after 2 decades remains Michel Foucault, who is always writing about the body. And I know that he's still in a lot of circles found to be abstruse or you know, remote, but I've never found that. He can be difficult, sure, but he's always returning to the body in one way or another. And that's an incredibly useful reminder.
Right. Do you find it difficult to combine in your writing, let's say, academic elements, you know, academic concepts referring to theoreticians on the one hand, and these very concrete scenes and personal experiences on the other hand? Does that come easily to you, or is it hard? Does it feel risky, or do you basically feel that you know, doing this while being an academic works out for you?
I mean, it definitely feels, I mean, it feels less risky in the sense that there's not much professionally at stake for me. I mean, I've had a tenured position for 5 years now. And so I'm sort of, and that's not coincidental. That's when I started seriously writing the previous book, when I could sort of breathe out and allow myself to think that it's not crucial that I publish peer review articles anymore. It's still important, but it's not crucial. But it still feels incredibly risky in terms of readership and aesthetic impact. I mean, I still didn't know until late last fall that this book that's coming out now would become a book. I mean, it could still be a complete failure and something that shouldn't be published. And that's something that you really don't know until fairly late in the process. I think this is not to denigrate nonfiction writing, but I do think that in Norwegian publishing, there is still a significantly higher bar for publishing something that is literary with a capital L. In that, if you're with a quality publisher, as I'm fortunate enough to be, then something that doesn't quite need to meet that aesthetic standard. And so it feels risky to reach for something in which The theory is present, the academic insight is present, but there's still the matter of trying to achieve a working literary form, which is, to my mind, is the most interesting problem out there if you're writing.
Right.
And of course, I say that having tried and failed to write articles, peer review articles in the autoethnographic vein. I haven't mastered that format right. So and certainly not in the way that Cristina has. We can probably discuss that later. But it may be a temperamental issue as well, that something in me feels more comfortable writing about this stuff in a literary form rather than working on the same issues in a purely academic form, and that may be simply a matter of my own personal psychology.
Right. I'm going to bring in Cristina pretty soon, but I need to not forget to get back to this pretty fascinating issue of the visual representation of disability, which you have kind of doubly been moving into, it seems. First, because you become more visible as a public figure when your book does so well. At least, well, this is anecdotal, but I've certainly seen you more after that book, in public context than I did before. Which means that you are now visible, audio-visually, as well as in writing in another way. And then you sort of move into being visually represented more kind of by choice. You said you really wanted to play. Well, I don't know if you specifically wanted to play a disabled person. Oh, well, maybe this is the question. Did you want to play someone? Did you want to play a specific disabled person, or is this just a matter of fate that this is what you are, this is what you will have to do?
Yeah, I mean, my first book came out in 2010, and I think I had maybe 5 years of sort of minor public attention, where I tried my very best to never appear publicly, or certainly never to be photographed while using my wheelchair. So that was a matter of trying to avoid appearing as a disabled person. And then eventually I've grown more comfortable with that role, though I'm still very, very conscious of how I'm portrayed as a disabled person. So I'm interested in that. And I'm interested in that because of the broader issues at stake. So I'm going to introduce a theoretical concept now, which is narrative prosthesis. It's been developed chiefly by 2 American academics, David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder, and they use it to re-examine the Western canon. And their argument is that disabled people have never really been underrepresented. They've always been hyper-visible. I mean, from Oedipus, King Oedipus onwards, they've always been present. And you have a number of disabled gods in the Greek pantheon, in the Norse pantheon. You have disabled characters in Shakespeare. They are all over the place. But, runs the argument, they are usually represented in a particular way where disability inevitably stands for something else, hence prosthesis. And so the interesting thing to look at is how disability is represented and how it's made to stand for something else. There's a classical argument here about how disabled people are often portrayed as evil or as victims, or sometimes as angelic / heroic figures. You've got Tiny Tim in A Christmas in Dickens. You know, there are a number of stereotypes to choose from, but the underlying topic, and this goes at the core of what the concept of narrative prosthesis is about, has to do with there always having to be a reason for disability being part of a narrative. It can't never It can't appear naturally, as it were. It's always part of the narrative machinery. We are interested in deviation from the normal, and so disability may signal that a character is worthy of interest. It also provides motivation. It provides the basis of a character arc. It sets the character up for redemption, for being made whole, or for death. So a couple of different things are signaled by disability, and that, of course, turned out to be true of the character I played as well in Occupied. So
yeah, maybe this is a good time for you to show us some images.
Yeah, I was going to say. So let's see if I can do this without losing track of where I am. If you can see the image here, I think I'll try to just leave all of the trimmings around, if you don't mind, so I don't lose my navigational structure here. So this is Occupied, and this is me.
Could you go to full screen view, please?
Yeah, there we go. Okay, so this is me playing. Well, playing. I'm exaggerating here, but an advisor to the Prime Minister. And my character started out as not being written as disabled. At some point, someone suggested me as a possible casting choice, and a character who was initially just a PR advisor, media advisor / spin doctor was turned into a disabled character. And initially that character was, I would say, probably there mainly for exposition purposes. He was the guy who told the viewer what was going on by interacting in dialogue with the other characters, a useful function for moving the plot along. And I've got some sample dialogue here, which probably shows that. So this is in Norwegian, but I'll try to translate. The text at the top is from my book. The dialogue is verbatim from a draft of the script. So Ivar Salvesen is a media advisor. He's hired by Prime Minister Jesper Berg in order to help during the election campaign on the recommendation of the Secretary Grete Sundby. The scripts change, the description of character changes. He's 32, now he's 35. He's a sympathetic looking man with an alert gaze. No, wait. He's got a congenital muscular condition which weakens his arms and legs considerably. He uses an electric wheelchair, except during travel. He's extremely ambitious. He's arrogant. And so the dialogue, the Prime Minister says, "Oh, according to Grete, you can analyze your way to discover what I'm thinking. Is that how it is?" And my character says, "Yes." "Okay, so what am I thinking?" "Well, provide me with access to your Google searches, and I'll tell you the answer." So it's not Shakespeare, but it's functional dialogue. Right. Now, two things happen here. First, during the introduction of that character, the screenwriters clearly struggled with how to and in what degree they should explain the fact that he's in a wheelchair, how they should address that. And so there were some very curious scenes in early drafts, which sort of explained it in a way that didn't need explaining. So here's a different scene. And this is one of the earliest scenes in which this character, Ivar Salvesen, appears, where the secretary who hired him asks, "So, what will you be doing this weekend?" And he says, "Matilda's parents are coming around, so we have a babysitter. We haven't been out since Richard was born." And the description says, Grete didn't know that Ivar had children. She's very surprised, but she has enough tact not to say anything. Ivar gives a crooked smile. He's used to this response. And then he says, "Yes, I have a wife and a child. Fortunately, I have an assistant to help me." And Grete nods. She regrets bringing up this topic of conversation. It's a bit of an odd scene. It doesn't really tell us anything in terms of the overall drama in the series, but it's nevertheless there in order to, you know, explain why on earth this character is in a wheelchair. It was cut eventually, probably on grounds of economy, and I was very relieved because it's the one scene I told them straight up was weird and had no actual function. But they struggled, I think, to find a solution, and the solution that they eventually found was to turn the character from someone who was something of an assistant, a minor helpful character for the prime minister, turning him into an antagonist. So he became not just a spin doctor, but something more along the lines of a Cambridge Analytica type villainous data analyst who had his own agenda and who wound up collaborating with some very bad people who went around throwing acid in people's faces, that kind of thing. So yeah, he became a villain in a wheelchair. And I remember bringing this up with one of my one of the other people on set, if I remember correctly. It was the actor playing Grete, and she said, "Well, that's odd. I didn't think of him that way. He was just this sort of calculating villainous character in a wheelchair, not like a stereotype." Well, that is kind of my point. So there are, of course, a number of precedents here. You've got Samuel Jackson playing the villain in the film Unbreakable and its sequels. You've got Dr. No, the arch villain from the first major James Bond picture. You've got Darth Vader from the Star Wars franchise, and you've got, of course, Captain Hook himself with an actual prosthesis on his hand. All of these villains have, shall we say, pretty clear motivations for doing what they do. And we know all there is to know about them as soon as we see them. So it's a very useful way of thinking about character. It's a very useful way of presenting character. And the prosthesis works in a way where their personality, their psychology is manifest. So they are incomplete, they are struggling to become whole, and they will never be whole. For villains, the issue is usually resolved through death. In Occupied, it's less dramatic, but it's certainly resolved through failure of achievement. So that's just one branch of a major discussion here. For me personally, as a public figure, it's been, and I addressed this in the book, it's been more interesting to look at the sort of the heroic narrative, the inspirational narrative, and how that functions in the Norwegian public sphere. And I also address it with reference to other Norwegian public figures who are disabled, like the Paralympic athlete and advocate Birgit Skarstein, who is probably the most famous disabled person in Norway, and who has had quite a lot of weight put on her shoulders in terms of how disability should be represented. So I've found it interesting to write about these narratives, both from the inside and from the outside, and how narrative patterns really take on a life of their own and a governing role in representational forms.
Right. And now your visibility and your legitimacy will be amped up, or has been amped up further by the Fritt Ord Prize, which means that you that there will be added expectation for you to, I guess, enter into the inspirational figure role. Are you up for that? What are your feelings about that?
My hope is that there's a way of shifting the conversation right now. So I think it's important to note that this prize was given to 3 people, not to any one of us. And we have Olaug Nilsen and Bjørn Hatterud and myself have written about disability in very different ways. So Olaug comes at this from the perspective of the mother of a severely disabled child, whereas Bjørn has, in a very different way from me, addressed issues of class and of sexual orientation. in connection with disability. So we are dealing with very different topics in our writing, and so I think that there may be an opening now, a window to shift this away from individual inspirational stories towards the really heterogeneity and intersectionality of the disability field. I'm certainly going to try to do that. But also the thing that I'm trying to do with the new book is to address the issue of invisible labor, and to show through writing, through experiential writing, and through very concrete stories, the sheer amount of invisible labor that accompanies and is inextricable from appearing as a disabled person in the public sphere. I mean, I've been, I would say, extremely fortunate in my career, and there's no denying that. And I think that has to do with my invisible labor and the invisible labor of my parents. So there are issues here of class background, of cultural capital, but it's also, as evidenced through the archive that I was talking about before, the incredible amount of work that had to be undertaken by my parents and some of their allies in order to make sure that I received a good education in good schools with other non-disabled children, that I was able to be socialized into broader society and was not consigned to a disability ghetto, as a lot of disabled children were and still are. That I was given opportunities that depended on efforts. And so I think that's really the key issue here, because that also ties into other discussions about invisible labor, which is of course gendered and which is racialized, which has to do with many other identity categories, but which it's always difficult to make visible, because it's not labor that is, well, to put it grandly, it's not labor that is recognized under capitalism.
Right. I think we may well have opportunity to return to the issue of invisible labor. Since we're almost now at a half-time point, I think it would be good to have a break so people's Zoom minds don't get too overtaxed. I certainly myself tend to get tired. And when we come back, I think we'll bring in Cristina, who I think has responses to several of the things that have been brought up. So I'll just, for now, say thanks a lot to you, Jan, and we'll take a break until 2:05 and be back then. So thank you, guys. Thank you to Jan.
Thank you, Espen.
All right, welcome back, everyone. And I have the pleasure of introducing now my colleague, Professor Cristina Archetti, a professor of political communication at the same department as I am in at the University of Oslo, which is the Department of Media and Communication. And she fairly recently published a book called Childlessness in the Age of Communication. She has also, and somewhat prior to that, been using poetry as a mode of investigation in connection with her scholarly work. So there's really any number of possible connections here to do with normality, marginalization, vulnerability, and not least how to write about it, how to find the words. So Cristina, perhaps you'd like to address that and introduce us a little bit further to your work.
Yes, for sure. And yeah, first of all, it's great to be here. And yeah, congratulations to Jan on such a powerful book, which I read basically in one day. And I was talking to him about it yesterday, and I was saying, for me, the hallmark of quality is how you feel after you've read the book. And I felt that it resonated so deeply with me that I really felt like I had been in a car crash in a positive sense. So, and this is, yeah, this should be taken as a compliment to how powerful it was, because it really raises many questions and many issues that I could also identify with, and many of my interviewees, so those I interviewed also, whose stories I wanted to represent in my book would have identified with. Just very briefly about my book for those who are not familiar with it. So it's Childlessness in the Age of Communication. The subtitle is Deconstructing Silence, because what I started off with was trying to explain the silence around involuntary childlessness, which is not having children not by choice. Already mentioning not having children not by choice might be a surprise for some people, because precisely because the mainstream discourse is that either you want a child or you don't. And so there seemed to be no problem, because we always have technology, right? And so it's practically almost an impossibility to think that you cannot have children if you if you want them, because you can fix it, right? You can fix the problem, but that's not the case. And in fact, the reason why I wanted to write this book was personal, because I was personally affected by this issue. My husband and I were diagnosed with unexplained infertility, which is an extremely confusing condition. And in fact, I can also relate to what Jan was talking about growing into an identity. So you are attached effectively a label of defectiveness, even if, according to the medical tests, both my husband and I are fertile, and simply medicine cannot explain why we don't get pregnant. So because medicine cannot know better, then they give us the fault, and so we tell us we are infertile regardless. So very confusing condition. It is a traumatic condition to be in. So I was trying effectively to address my demons by writing this. But there was a more deep academic and scientific question also. I realized at the beginning I felt completely alone, and I thought I was the only person suffering from this condition. And I realized, in fact, that effectively a quarter of the adult women and men in the Western world are childless, and 90% of them not out of choice. So I realized that I know about the needs of transgender people, who are 0.6% of the population. And by the way, it's great that we know about their needs. How come I've never heard about 25% of the adult population of the Western world? So in the age of communication, right? So for me, this was a mind-blowing question that I needed to address. And so this book was effectively came out as half theory, half experimental writing. So it was written in two voices, me the scientist and me the woman, where I was trying to deconstruct this silence, to explain it scientifically, but also, yeah, that's where the body comes in. I realized that I couldn't answer this question unless I also addressed the stories that are never told and the stories that get stored into the body. Because there are many reasons for the silence around infertility, but the most basic of them is that people affected by it don't talk about it because it's so painful. And so for me, the basic question was, in fact, connecting with this pain, which I myself was feeling. It's a physical pain, not only psychological suffering, and try to understand why it was there and where did it come from. And so that's how, for me, it became a question of, okay, how do I write about silence effectively? How do I write about these stories that are never told and that are effectively inside our bodies? And so that brings me back to what Jan was talking about. Well, he's talking about in his book, effectively this struggle for finding the words. And for example, there is something you write, I started to write because I needed a different language than the one I was offered. And I can totally relate to that, because I also wanted to find a different language than the one I could find in research about infertility, where the language is always about, it's a choice to have a child or not. So it's always about choices, and it's about individuals who are in charge of their destiny and make choices. And again, that's another aspect that brought me back also to your experience, and how we are interconnected so much with the environment around us. So in fact, there is even a sociologist, American sociologist, Andrew Abbott, who says we shouldn't even be talking about individuals. We should regard every single one of us as a society, because we are so interconnected and dependent on others. And at the end, our life goes in directions that, yeah, we might want to steer it one way, but it ends up in another way. So that's, I wanted to counter this medical language, as in your case, a language that was quantitative and based on statistics about demographics and fertility. It was a language that was obfuscating and really killing all the stories of every single individual I met and I talked to. So in my book is based a lot on my experience, so autoethnography, but basically I use my experience to illustrate the experiences of many other individuals whom I interviewed. I also did a content analysis of movies, the representation of childlessness in movies, and by the way, it's very similar to the one you have portrayed, because they are villains, they are evil, they are killers, they are crazy, because yeah, they cannot be happy, so they want everyone else to be unhappy. Yes, so that's that was one reason for writing the book. You also write, I'm trying to write myself out of others' language. I'm trying to write myself out of the gaze of others. And that was also another reason for me to write, to try and find the words to escape the way other people were labeling me, and to escape their language, and to basically rewrite my story. So because in the mainstream narrative, you don't have a child, you cannot have access to happiness, to a realized life, you don't have a family. Well, can I find a different story? And so the book was about trying to find these words. And in fact, in trying to find these words, when you mentioned the archive, so you had this archive of letters, and I also used different materials in my book. But while you mentioned that, it occurred to me that really my body was also my archive, was part of the materials I tried to access to. And also when, for example, you mentioned that you were writing you were thinking while you were writing about what you want to write, what you need to write, and definitely that was part of also of my writing process. But also for me, it was also a matter of what I felt I needed to write. So it was almost like the writing was coming out of the body. And for me, there was a healing process involved also in this writing. It was almost like by getting these words out, you can get some of the pain out. So I was going to maybe we can continue the conversation. I've got so many points that I would like to make, but maybe I can ask you whether what kind of effect did the act of writing actually have on you? So did this have this healing effect, perhaps?
It's a good question. I'm not sure if healing is the right word, but I think that it had a transformative effect. I think the work was really important, and I think the act of making a book, making an object that I think I came to find aesthetically successful was good. But I do address the topic a little bit indirectly in the book by talking about how this wasn't about finding healing, or it wasn't about finding any kind of wholeness as something new. It was about recognizing that I'd been fully human all along. I think so. It's more about countering the medicalizing and the dehumanizing narratives in order to rediscover something, perhaps. So I mean, it's complicated to talk about these things, but because the notion of healing has such an immense appeal, because there is damage, obviously, and so you want to have it repaired, but at the same time, the kind of repair that is on offer may not be good for you. So medicine has a very complicated role in these things, and particularly in the disability field, the notion of cure is very problematic, because there are unquestionably conditions that can be cured and should be cured, but at the same time, the vast majority of disabled people will never be cured. That's the simple fact. And so the notion of healing or cure becomes a source of damage in and of itself, simply because it's impossible. And probably that's the case in your field as well. You're talking about something that is medically unexplained, which means that, you know, there's no cure on the horizon as such. And so looking for healing probably means necessarily going beyond the medical framework, where perhaps healing is not the right word or concept at all.
Yes, I agree. And in fact, I think probably the best word would be acceptance of the situation as it is. And you say it's a transformation towards realizing, in my case, there was this realization that there was nothing defective with me. And in fact, the initial title I had in mind was The Irreparable Woman. And then while writing, I realized that actually I had never been broken. So in a way, I was irreparable because I never needed the repairing in the first place.
Yeah, I can't help but returning a little bit to the narrative prosthesis concept, which is what you can use to pinpoint the sort of the presupposition of damage or a lack that has to be repaired. There was a really good book on childlessness and infertility published in Norway last year, called The Golde Landet, the Wasteland, where Karin Haugen opens with quotes from 7 different fairy tales, where the king and the queen are unable to conceive, and it is a sorrow to them. And that it's from 7 different sources, but the quote is almost verbatim the same. So it's an incredibly deeply embedded narrative of lack and damage as well, far older probably than the medical framing of these issues. So, but it's still a matter of which story are you invited to place yourself in, and what are the demands made upon you by that story?
Sorry.
No, sorry, I was going to say that I actually had the opportunity to meet this author while she was writing this, because her publisher knew me, and so she organized this meeting. Yes. And it's very interesting because she talks about the experience of infertility, but that's also very controversial from my perspective, because at the end she did have a child. In fact, as a second as well. And so for us, we never managed to get a child at the end. So there is a question: can you actually talk about this experience? Well, of course, you have gone through the experience, but you don't know the worst of it, because in a way you had the happy ending. And it's also interesting when it comes, for example, after the publication of your book, you have started being invited and you have become the voice of disability. And it's interesting how I can see this difference when journalists contact you. For example, I've seen her invited in events, and I'm thinking, okay, these people who invited her knew that I was writing about this, but clearly they don't want the bad ending story. while I've become the face, and that's really surprised to me, in Norway. Why do they need a foreigner to be the face of this? Because there are no other Norwegians who are available of the story that ends badly. And so, yeah, for example, the other day I was interviewed about a story about livssorg, is it grief in life? Mm-hmm. And I was and there were two people interviewed in this story, and one was a psychologist who wrote about grief, and the other was me. And I was thinking, how was it possible that they didn't find another Norwegian? So it's that's part of explaining the silence, because some stories are untellable and people don't want to hear them. But yeah, it's interesting how we can split identities in smaller categories. Like, for example, Karin Haug would be regarded as childless, but from my perspective, no, she's not, because she has a child at the end.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that, and it's one of the things that I think I struggled most with in writing both of these books, to address the fact that I'm in so many ways incredibly privileged, and that is the reason why I'm able to write these books in the first place. So I can't really, I'm trying quite hard in both of them to avoid speaking on behalf of others, while at the same time invoking the field of disability and everything that goes with that. But I'm particularly concerned with exactly what you were saying, that there's a desire in mainstream society to hear the success stories, because that will actually allow you to rest comfortably with this problem not being such a great problem after all. So there's an incredible demand for the happy ending. The disability too can be presented in a way where it becomes inspirational, and so can effectively be dismissed as the incredible socioeconomic problem that it is.
So I want to start gradually bringing in the audience here. So if you have a comment, anyone, or a question, please just indicate by marking with an X in the chat so I can easily see all of you. Cristina, to the question of finding the words. We were talking in advance of this, and you said that reading Jan was an experience of him finding some words or some means of writing that were similar to yours, whereas others were quite different. Could you address those similarities and differences a little bit?
Yes, yeah, definitely. And Jan, for example, also uses the poetic, and also he mixes the theory with the everyday experience, and that's also what I've tried to do as well. But then, yeah, I admire, for example, that you write a book that is all literary, while, for example, I wanted to stay into the academic genre, and so in a way I have tried to stretch to the limit the academic genre, partly because I was wondering why. Okay, partly because I thought if I write a popular book, a literary book, but a book for the greater public, it will count little from the perspective of my academic CV. And so I was concerned in that respect. But then also because in my case, I wanted to raise the profile of the childlessness voices, because so far you have the memoir, and so I thought at least that's in my field, in my domain. So you have this sad story of the person who didn't manage to conceive, but then I wanted it to make it academic, to explain what explains this silence. So it's not just a sad story. Okay, that was a different in genre. Then maybe mine is more introduces a variety of different experiments. So maybe like imagined scenes or scripts from TV, dreams. So at the end, we are actually trying to do the same thing. So for me, it was fascinating how we are using different tools to try and get to the same results effectively.
Right. So you are it's kind of interesting to see that it seems like even for people with as experimental a cast as you two, there's still the kind of a dividing line where it's either an academic text that you sort of try to expand, or it's or it's a generalist literary non-fiction product that incorporates academic insight. So I don't know whether you would agree that even for people who are so attuned to the possibility of melting those together, there's still a dividing line persists.
Mm. Well, you're speaking about the genre there, really.
Yeah.
And I think it's nearly impossible to write a serious text without addressing genre in some way. So you're dealing with expectations on many levels. With well, I mean, you've got the sort of the baseline concerns of who's going to publish this. And how are they going to deal with it in publishing? And the publisher needs to know what kind of book they're processing. But it's also to do with, I think, with the reader contract in a way that you're setting out on the cover, on the initial pages. You're setting out some of the terms for what you're writing, and the one thing you don't want is for your reader to be confused about what kind of text they're reading. You can challenge them, you can make the text demanding, but there should be some degree of clarity in a way. And an academic text will raise some expectations, while a literary text will raise others. And so I think it's very hard to make a complete hybrid between the two. Although you can of course come very close with certainly with, as Cristina says, with invented scenes in an academic work, or with quote unquote academic references in a literary work. Just a sort of a random factoid. I remember that I was very pleased that my book was when it was first presented in a catalog, it was placed alongside novels, but it was still marked out as nonfiction.
Right.
So that was having it both ways in a sense. But you can't make the categories go away even as you negotiate with them and maybe try to transcend them in some ways.
Right. How about your poems, Cristina? Do you publish them both in academic and extra academic contexts? How does that work for you?
I actually, so far, I'm publishing them only in academic context.
Right.
Well, in fact, the other day I got a notification that one of my poems will be published in Klassekampen, in Norwegian as well. But yeah, otherwise I only use them in my academic writing. But yeah, I agree with Jan. At the end, we can't go away the genres. But then that's why I really wanted to publish also in the academic genre, because I want to push it from the inside. And also so everything I do in this book has a theoretical and methodological justification. And even the invented scenes are scenes that I'm playing in my mind. So it's about showing that, you know, what is real is not just what you can touch, what you can count, but it's also what happens in the mind and imagination. So including dreams, including imagined conversations, that's part of showing you what it means to be this childless person in a society organized around family. Yeah, but basically, again, I wanted to try and push the academic genre. And for me, really, even the literary should be part of the academic genre, and the creative writing and even the poetry. That's why I'm publishing in academia, because it needs to be part of the account of reality. You can't just give account of the kind of quantitative sides. You also need to give account from the other side, maybe the emotional side, of course, if appropriate. But yeah, as I said, it's part of my agenda.
All right. Let's turn to the questions. It would be great if you guys could just spend a sentence or two to introduce yourselves. First, Camilla Ek-Tverbak, please.
Hello, thank you for a very interesting hour and a half so far. I'm a professor in drama and theatre communication at Oslo Met. Have had some collaborations with Cristina before, and now actually. But I'm kind of stepping back a few steps when you were talking about this, the happy endings is what's mostly wanted and communicated. And I was kind of interested in that and thinking that the sort of unsuccessful endings are also the unresolved. It's also much more difficult, I'm thinking, to address and put into words. That the academic genre perhaps also likes the successful endings because they're resolved, you know, that they're pointing towards a conclusion, an answer, if you like, while the unsuccessful is much more open and uncertain in a sense. So I was kind of thinking about how the academic genre, traditionally at least, is looking for you know what results we've come to, and that genre, in my experience, is often has more difficulty with more open-ended stuff, let's say. And I wanted to actually to draw another example that I'm sort of relating to in my life about children who don't easily define into one of the two male or female sexual identities, and how the public discourse is about, you know, being born in the wrong body, which is a discourse I find very difficult, because I think these people or these children it's the way that society is trying to resolve again a problem or a feeling of uncertainty that the society has difficult to stay in, something that's not resolved and not clearly defined. That we want, you know, we want to fix it. We want to push them either into that category or that category, not allowing these subjects to stay more uncertain. So that's just another example of this pressure, I think, in society of wanting resolved endings.
Do you want to respond to that, Jan or Cristina? First, if you want.
Yeah, I mean, I very much agree, but and I think it's in terms of thinking about stories, for certainly for disability, it's resistance against closure is a very important form of resistance, as I touched on before. The ending to a disability story in the Western canon tends to be cure or death. And so resistance is really whatever is open-ended, whatever remains unresolved. And I can't speak for Cristina, but I think I recognize some of the same issues at stake. The sort of the story of childlessness is resolved with a child, but the unresolved living on without a child is pretty difficult to turn into a recognizable story. It becomes a non-story, or just a plain unending tragedy in these discourses. So it's interesting to see what happens in going beyond the established patterns.
Jan, I'm reminded that you ended your book of 2018 with a birth.
Yeah.
The birth of your son, which does not appear as a happy end or anything like that, but it's still, of course, a deliberate choice to end with a birth. Yeah. So why did you do that?
I think probably the honest answer is that it provided dramatic closure while still opening the door to a new chapter. So it worked in terms of narrative, and that is a compromise to fall back on established narrative mechanisms in order to make the book interesting to the reader. And I mean, I'm reluctant to do so, and at the same time I want my books to be read, and so I'm forced to reckon with narrative. And I do something along the same lines in the new book, where the framing device is the research stay that my family and I had in California last year, which was of course interrupted by COVID and forced us to return home in something of a hurry around this time of the year in 2020. And so the sort of the journey outwards and the return provides some of the narrative framework, which allows me to talk in more discursive ways about other topics. But I think that some of those narrative formats are necessary in order to make the books work as literature.
Right. Did you want to respond as well, Cristina?
Yes, just very briefly. Yes, I wanted to say that, I mean, that's also why I use the creative writing and experimental writing rather than only academic writing, specifically because of this linear structure that is in the academic work, in the academic writing. And also even the academic authority, the authoritative voice comes from being able to give a clear answer. So there is no space for uncertainty or for open-endedness. And that's why I needed to mix the genre, to disrupt it, to precisely also show this this uncertainty.
Right. Next question is from Jenny Krutzina. I hope I'm not mangling your surname.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, I'm Jenny Krutzina. I'm a senior research fellow at the University of Bergen. I have a background in bioethics, and I study disability issues from a philosophical perspective, mostly mixed in with some social sciences. Thank you very much. This has been truly excellent. I've read both of your books, so this has been fantastic to have this opportunity to listen to you discuss it. And I'm just wondering about something that I sort of thought about when Jan was mentioning this need to provide an account of yourself. And I think you were talking mostly about with regard to the state. So you have to justify that you need certain accommodations and so on, and you have to kind of describe yourself in probably the worst possible terms to access the services that you need. But I'm also wondering, there's a different dimension to this need to provide an account of yourself, and this is with regard to society or people around us. And I'm wondering here also something that you mentioned, to what extent sort of a gendered element comes in here quite strongly, like listening to both of you here. It feels to me that there's some kind of, I mean, people tend to like, I guess, binaries or dichotomies. So we have this emotional versus physical challenge, infertility being seen as a psychological, emotional problem more than a physical problem, unless there's underlying physical causes maybe. One is visible, one is invisible in many cases. One is perceived, as Cristina pointed out, as a choice, because there's always a way of having a child. And working in adoption research myself, it's always the ultimate solution, go for adoption or surrogacy or so on, versus the non-choice. And given the two different approaches, the literary versus the academic, I wonder whether the choice of the genre to describe these situations in a narrative way, the academic approach also shields against some kind of accusations of being overly emotional or being just talking, you know, the angry woman kind of accusation that we see so often in you know, when I mean, even looking at Cristina's article in Aftenposten last year, I think it was, and just looking at the comment section below, really it surprised me, not, but maybe it should have surprised me in the sense that there was all of this rhetoric around, you know, yeah, but if you really wanted to, maybe you could. And it still feels to me that there's an element of gender that comes into play. And Jan hinted at intersectionality earlier. So I'm wondering whether your choices of way of writing about your experiences was also maybe influenced by your gender perspective in a sense.
You want to take that first, Cristina?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, now that you mention it, yes, I mean, a reason why I went for the academic genre, and it's also because I didn't want to sound like, the sad childless woman who tells her heartbreaking story about her meaningless life. But also I agonized really a lot about the academic side of this book, because I mean, the reviewers told me that this was an absolute tour de force, because I mean, it's really the size of a PhD, if not larger, because I'm engaged with literature from anthropology, sociology, sexuality studies, infertility, because I was really concerned about coming across as the crazy childless woman, effectively, because that is the stereotype. And not just a childless hero, but woman as well. In fact, there is a quote in my book about, now forgive me, her name escapes me, but she's a famous Norwegian writer. And she did say that basically if Karl Ove Knausgård had had been a woman, he would have never been published. So they say, what, 2,000 pages of personal emotions and everything from a woman? You must be joking. But if it's from a man, then we're all paying attention. So yes, the way I wrote it was influenced by the fact that I'm a woman and I'm childless.
Jan, you want to respond as well?
Sure. I mean, first of all, I agree that it's these issues are clearly gendered, and that the issue of psychosomatic explanations and attributions of moral blame have a clear gendered dimension as well. I mean, I've only dabbled in these issues of, but I definitely recognize that. I think that the challenge in a lot of different ways is to overcome a certain expectation of marginality or particularity. Karl Ove Knausgård writes for all humans, whereas a woman would be writing only for women. That's the sort of the reductive argument. And that was the thing that haunted me certainly in writing my book, and trying to get past this being a book about simply about one wheelchair user's experience, because wheelchairs too connote marginality and specificity. And so I spent a great deal of time working on how exactly to introduce my wheelchair in the text. I had to do so fairly early on, but at the same time, I didn't want to do it in a way that would turn the reader off. And so I tried to insinuate it on, I think it was the 3rd page or so, establishing myself as a narrative voice first, and then presenting a scene where the reader's sympathy would be anchored in me as I introduced the wheelchair. Hopefully that worked, but it's a challenge to overcome that way that the culture has of placing encapsulating some problems or some issues within minority identities, even when that sort of minority is a gender. So it's a I think we come at this issue from very different angles, Cristina and I, but there are recognizable things there as well.
I guess maybe there's a kind of a strategic choice involved when you're fighting stereotypes. Or let me hear what you think about this possible sort of two-prong or two alternatives. You can sort of affirm difference and say yes, I'm different, and that's good. You should acknowledge it. Versus saying that this is normal too. You should admit you should admit also me into your normality. Your normality should be wide enough to include also me. Is this in your guys' experiences? Is this a real choice? Are these two distinct alternatives for you?
Probably not. I think they're the same thing, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think they're two sides of the same issue. I mean, we live in a time where normality as a statistical construct, but also as a normative idea is incredibly strictly policed. So a disability scholar who I've learned a lot from, Rosemary Garland Thompson, talks about the normate, the normal body that also provides a norm that has to be lived up to. So these are dual aspects, right? And that goes to, this derives from the early history of statistics, where the l'homme moyen, the sort of average man, began as simply as a generalization from the average, right? But it very soon became normative in the sense that it became what deviance was measured against, and we've lived with that for nearly 2 centuries now. It's, you know, the psychiatry is not my field, but it seems to be one of those fields where, as key figures in that field have pointed out, notably the American psychiatrist Alan Francis, the scope for normality is becoming more narrow. He gives as an example the fact that under current diagnostic guidelines, grief, a key human emotion, is something that is delimited to a normal and pretty strictly regulated space of time. If you grieve beyond a certain number of months after a tragic life event, after losing a loved one, then it becomes pathological. Yeah. That's one example among many. But I think the sort of the idea of normative normality haunts all of these stories.
Right.
But can I also say that for me this idea of normality is also related to the generalization that is inherent in the use of certain methods. So again, in my case, it was the statistics, demography, I mean, with all their numbers and figures that were erasing the personal stories. And so I think probably I was trying to question the very idea of normality by providing all these details, showing how nuanced any life is, and my life is presented, so I focus particularly on my life, but then I was a kind of composite character representing the lives of many other people like me, and so perhaps it's not trying to fit into a normality, but maybe questioning that the fact that the normality is in itself constructed and it's in itself an illusion, because there is, what is normality? Yeah, who is really normal?
Right, there's a question from Karin Nyheim Solbecke, please.
Thank you, and thanks for organizing this, and especially congratulations to both Cristina and Jan. I know Cristina's work from before, and which is great, and also read several works of Jan. So I think I will be quite short because we're running out of time, but I think my question goes to Jan, because I was as others, intrigued by this topic on the choice of genre in order to transcend categories and stereotypes and so on. And I was a little bit surprised that you have taken this choice of, how can I say, not bringing your subjective experiences or your life role into your strictly academic work, but more into the literature or the fiction of yours. So because this is a kind of issue, a question of what kind of contract you have with the reader. So my question is, what kind of reader do you foresee, readers of academic works? Because as a professor in sociology and working on health and illness, when I write my academic works, I often foresee a reader that is very into this field of taking the subjective experiences also as a point of departure for doing academic work. So, I mean, you also mentioned Rosemary Gallick Johnson and others like Leonor Manderson, who has written extensively, taking her own prosthesis as a point of departure for theorizing disability. So I was just wondering, do you see such a clear cut between the type of contract you have with the fictional reader and the academic reader, and to put it on the I kind of, is there a gendered thing here also between you and Cristina in choice of genre and in choice of bringing your own subjective experience into the field? I think that's a really, really interesting question. Not necessarily about the gender thing, but it's more how do you resonate about this kind of gap or distinction?
It's a challenging question. I think, honestly, I think that there are two parts to my answer. One is that my particular experience of learning to write is an important part of this. As I spoke about initially, I started writing serious academic articles roughly around the same time that I started to write fiction seriously. And so I've always shifted between genres and found that doing work in one field can be really helpful for work in another field, trying to find the right fit for expressing certain ideas. And so the shape of the 2018 book came about through trying and failing, and in dialogue with some very good editors at my publishers, Gyldendal, where eventually it became the book that it is now. I mean, I remember applying for a writing grant for that book initially, where I tacked much more towards the academic, discussing it as more or less an academic essay collection about disability. And then it turned out to be something entirely different once I'd really worked at it. So that was partly accident and partly the people I worked with collaboratively while developing that manuscript. But the second part is that I suspect that I'd, by that point, become a little frustrated with being in the field of disability studies, which is a very small field, and where a lot of the things I was saying felt kind of obvious to my implied reader and to my expected reader. So I felt like I wasn't really telling anyone anything they didn't already know. And there was very, very little chance of me reaching readers beyond that academic subfield. I mean, as you know, even the distance between disability studies and the sociology of health and illness can be considerable at times. And of course, that means that we should keep working at interdisciplinary dialogue in academia, as we are currently doing. But also for me, it felt like a more valuable use of my time to try and address it to a reader beyond that field. And that required me to make some choices, like not using academic terminology unless it was with a clear poetic bent to the language. And I consciously chose not to use the word disability except for a single time in that book, when I was writing about what I was doing in academia. So the new book is different. There I address disability much more head-on as a concept and as a phenomenon. But in my first time round, I really tried to go beyond readers who I'd already been talking to for 10 years or so, to try and reach readers who didn't know much about disability before. And that turned out to be a really giving experience for me as a writer as well.
Can I also say something quickly? That I mean, at the end, we do publish in different outlets, but I don't think our language is actually that different. And I think I don't see, I think it depends on the fields probably, and maybe in your field is more, you need to distinguish more rigidly between the academic language and the non-academic language. But in my case, I think years ago, I decided that I was going to write like a human being, even when I was being an academic. And so I've always tried to write in the easiest way possible. So even if I publish this book as an academic book, because it's with an academic publisher, I mean, some of the reviewers are people who are childless activists, and they are not academics, and they told me it's super easy to read. And so I don't think, so although for strategic reason we might want to access some outlets rather than others, but I think essentially we are trying to communicate with the largest audience possible. And I think definitely that was my case.
Right. Writing as a human being. That could be a pretty good way of rounding off. If there's no one who wants very much to have a short say, that does not seem to be the case. So I will only plug our next seminar, which takes place at 1 o'clock on the 29th of April, where two people who have just earned their PhDs, Elisabeth Brun and Andreas Ervik, will address the issues of conceptual versus experimental creativity in research. One from a filmmaker's angle, another, I think, predominantly from a writerly angle. So that should be really interesting. That's coming up next time. For now, biggest thanks to Jan, a big thanks to Cristina as well, and to all of you for your attendance and for your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Espen. Great to be here.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.